Okay, good. Well, good afternoon. Welcome to this afternoon's simultaneous session. My name is Todd Hibbard, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Professor Richard J. Bautch. Since 2000, Rich has been a faculty member at St. Edward's University in Austin, Texas, where he is Professor of Humanities and Associate Dean in the School of Humanities. Rich has published widely on the literary, religious, and social worlds of Second Temple Judaism, from the Persian to the Roman periods. His publications include studies on notions of covenant, kinship, and community identity, as well as the development of literary collections in ancient Judaism. His work is focused on a wide array of both biblical and non-biblical texts, such as Deuteronomy, Isaiah, Nehemiah, to name just a few, as well as the Dead Sea Scrolls and various deuterocanonical works. His current projects include a new commentary on Second Chronicles in the Ancient Bible Commentary series and a co-written commentary on First and Second Maccabees for the Wisdom Commentary series. So Rich is knee-deep in the commentary writing right now. Within the CBA, Rich has held several important roles, including being a member of the executive board and co-convener of the Hermeneutics Task Force. Currently, he serves as the general editor of the CBQ monograph series and the CBQ imprint series, which he originated. He's also held various visiting professorships, including the Gregorian Foundation Chair at the Pontifical Biblical Institute in 2019. On a personal note, I will just say I've had the privilege of knowing Rich for some 25 years, having met as grad students in the theology department at Notre Dame in the mid-1990s. I have fond memories of reading Aramaic texts together in Joe Blinkensop's Aramaic course, among other things. At least they're fond in my recollection. Since then, we've had the opportunity to work together on various publication projects, and I've really come to appreciate Rich's dedication to rigorous and wide-ranging scholarship, as well as his genial and collaborative nature. This afternoon, Rich will offer a paper entitled "The Covenant of Levi as Rebuttal to the Pentateuchal Redaction." And I'm going to invite you to use the chat to pose questions. So if you have questions, let me ask you to use that, and I will sort of collect those and moderate those and pass those along to Rich. If you have a follow-up question that is urgent and you feel like you need to raise some issue in a follow-up question, you can use the raise hand feature to ask that. But please know, if you do that, you're going to be brought into the video stream. So that will be for asking verbal questions as follow-ups. I now need to remind you of the protocols for our session. You've no doubt heard this by now, but I think I'm contractually obligated to read this. So let me remind you of the following. Participants are expected to identify themselves by their real names. Participants should not record this presentation in audio or video. Participants are encouraged to use the Zoom features to communicate, but inappropriate comments or behavior will lead to immediate removal from the conference. A videotape of this session will be posted to the CBA website. By agreeing to appear in the Zoom window with audio and/or visual contributions, you grant permission to the CBA to broadcast your likeness to social media outlets. And so with those provisos in view, I ask you now to join me in welcoming Rich as he presents his paper. Rich?
Todd, thank you so much for that kind and nostalgic introduction. My thanks too to the program committee of CBA for inviting me to speak here today. It is an absolute honor to be able to share with you my current research on covenant in the Persian period, and specifically on the covenant of Levi in the book of Malachi. There's a handout for today. We're going to give Zoom a rest, and the handout is easily accessed. If you recall where you clicked to enter the Zoom call, there's also a button that says handout. So just click there and the handout is yours. The handout has my bibliography. So as I refer to scholars in passing, you can get more information about their publications there. I have the texts, the Hebrew text, largely from Malachi, for you to follow along. And also, there's an outline. So a point-by-point outline, and I'll refer to these points as I deliver my presentation so that we can all stay together. On the outline, the first point is introduction, but it's really an overture. For the next 5 minutes, I'll be bringing forth and setting before you the main elements in my presentation today. Thank you so much. In the book of Malachi, the covenant of Levi is attested twice, in 2:4 and then in 2:8. The biblical writers responsible for the covenant of Levi provided it with contours and a unique body of teaching. Moreover, the covenant contains polemics of the sort that one social group directs at its rival. As such, the covenant of Levi contributes to the tremendous range of covenantal perspectives that emerged during the Persian period. It also reflects the pluralistic social fabric of Yehud in the 4th and 3rd centuries. It would be a mistake to harmonize the covenant of Levi with other covenants in Malachi, or to conflate it with major covenantal traditions, such as those associated with Abraham and Moses. This misguided approach is exemplified in the Anchor Bible Dictionary, which construes the book of Malachi in terms of one predominant theme: Israel's covenantal relationship with God. Andrew Hill, the author of the ABD entry, asserts, quote, the unity of the covenantal theme, end of quote, adding that, quote, the covenantal themes of Malachi are so thoroughly integrated and logically presented within the prophet's discourse that any attempts of rearranging the material in the text prove most unconvincing, end of quote. Hill's pan-covenantal approach to Malachi is indicative of an earlier era of scholarship, when the place of covenant in Israelite religion was routinely overstated and viewed through a proto-Christian lens. Ironically, scholars who thought covenant to be the mitzvah treated it reductively, in as much as pacts such as the covenant of Levi were subsumed into the theological vortex of covenant qua relationship with God. Yet to understand the covenant of Levi, we focus on its contours, on its unique teaching, and on its polemics. The covenant of Levi has a discrete meaning that emerges from certain Levitical circles at the time of its composition in the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE. It would be equally mistaken, however, to study the covenant of Levi in isolation. The covenant is distinctive, but not detached from Judean and priestly life. Any analysis, therefore, must have an eye to other texts, the various parts of Malachi, as well as the nascent Pentateuch. In the 4th and 3rd centuries, the Pentateuch is in a formative stage, and those developments are not simply proximate to the covenant of Levi, but they may be reflected there. In fact, my paper today will argue in its conclusion that Pentateuchal developments provide the impetus for the covenant of Levi. As for the book of Malachi, it is generally agreed that the book comprises 6 paranetic speeches that take the form of disputations. This division of the text along literary critical lines is serviceable to a degree. There are, however, linguistic patterns forming motifs that cut across the 6 oracles and can be fully understood only when Malachi is read holistically. For example, the command to fear and glorify God's name recurs with frequency and becomes the leitmotif. There are other thought patterns expressed more episodically. With some of these expressions, repetition is discernible, but it may not rise to the level of a pattern or a motif. In the present analysis, motifs play a pivotal role in the book of Malachi. There are key motifs, and indeed a leitmotif that expresses the book's major idea. I will demonstrate that fearing God's name is Malachi's leitmotif, and it serves as the book's axis. Other verbal patterns indicate more limited themes that nonetheless relate to core ideas in Malachi. These relational lines are drawn neither statically nor linearly. The text rather is dynamic, with puns and reversals driving home a certain point to the stunned and sometimes scandalized reader. There are echoes and warped echoes that play on the repetition of triliteral roots in different Hebrew words. Expressions recall earlier expressions only to turn them on their head. When we focus on the covenant of Levi, there are 6 verses to consider, Malachi 2:4 through 2:9. The 6 verses contain some 11 instances of wordplay or allusion to the pattern language in Malachi. The covenant is highly intertextual. Furthermore, the 11 intertextual expressions do not provide a covenantal campfire. They do not affect spiritual unity or interpersonal harmony, as Andrew Hill suggests. Rather, polemics carry the day as one priestly group defines itself over and against another group. Given the predominance and importance of motif in Malachi, my study begins by reviewing the key words and phrases that constitute the main motifs in this late prophetic book. On our outline, this is point 2. Point 3, the next section, examines the covenant of Levi and clarifies its relationship to the thought world of Malachi and to certain polemics expressed in the book. The following section 4 locates said polemics in the context of the Pentateuchal redaction. What, you might ask, is the Pentateuchal redaction? By this, I mean the Pentateuchal redaction as a process whereby the authority of the first 5 biblical books was aligned with the figure of Moses through a series of textual innovations. And these include the insertion of certain texts, including the Aaronite blessing in Numbers 6. The Pentateuchal redaction thus transformed the association between the Torah and Moses in order that the transcribed Torah could assume a high degree of Mosaic authority, as well as Moses' function of mediating the divine will. If you'd like to learn more about the Pentateuchal redaction, I would invite you to read my essay, Deuteronomy and the Pentateuch. This is actually a chapter in the Oxford Handbook on Deuteronomy. And while the handbook is not yet published, my essay and several other chapters are available online. And there I do a deep dive into the Pentateuchal redaction and talk about its center point, Deuteronomy 34, the end of the Pentateuch, as a great window on the Pentateuchal redaction. The information about that essay of mine, Deuteronomy and the Pentateuch, is in the bibliography on the handout. So I invite you to read that sometime later. Well, today, what we want to do is continue with our presentation. And let me simply note that our final point, point 5, will be looking at the implications. The implications would suggest that the breadth and the scope of the opposition to the Pentateuchal redaction is greater than we have imagined. There are trace elements of the opposition found not only in Malachi, but as well in Chronicles, Jeremiah, and even Deuteronomy itself. What one sees in the end is how inconspicuous covenants, such as the covenant of Levi, function as part of an oppositional wave in the priestly politics of the Second Temple period. So, motifs and patterns in Malachi, point 2. The book of Malachi begins divisively with an account of the Lord loving Jacob but hating Esau. Familiar language continues in the next oracle, which asks rhetorically whether a father is due honor, kavod, and fear, morah, from his son. In the same verse, the father, who's also referred to as a Lord, castigates the priests who are despising his name, Azina Shemi. Herein are the key terms to Malachi's main idea. God's name is to be feared and honored, yet certain priests despise it. These are not obscure concepts, and the notion of fearing God, for example, is prominent in the Hebrew Bible. Here I have a very long footnote on fear of God in the Hebrew Bible. I will boil it down to this. Philip Michael Lasseter in 2016 published a book, Facets of Fear, The Fear of God in Exilic and Post-Exilic Contexts. It's a very good book. Lasseter concludes that fear of God is a motif in the Bible with diverse applications and under the control of no one school of thought. Thus, in his book, there's a chapter on Deuteronomy and Deuteronomy's understanding of fear of God. There's a chapter on Proverbs. There's even a chapter on Jeremiah. Interestingly, Lassiter does not have a chapter on Malachi. In fact, he barely treats fear of God in Malachi. So in some sense, my presentation today could be a missing chapter in this otherwise very good book. Fear of God in Deuteronomy is especially worth noting because it includes, whenever fear of God is mentioned, certain collocations. These are the collocations that Moshe Weinfeld has cataloged extensively in his classic Deuteronomy in the Deuteronomic School. It is noteworthy, however, that the writer of Malachi uses none of the standard Deuteronomic phrasing for fearing God, but asks rather, in Malachi 1:6, "If I am their Lord, where is my fear?" We do well to track this language, fear of God, which appears next in Malachi 1:14. Here a new oracle begins, "Cursed be the knave who vows to the Lord one of his flock, but sacrifices a spoiled animal." It continues, "I am a great king, and my name is feared among the nations, Shemi Norah Goyim," with emphasis for our purposes on fearing the name. It continues, "And now I give to you, the priests, this commandment," whereupon the priests are told to give glory to my name, L'tet kavod lishmi, lest God curse them and turn their blessings into a curse. Two things are important. The repetition of glorifying and fearing God's name further establishes the model of right response to God in Malachi. A motif is emerging. It will become the leitmotif. Also, the term commandment, like fear, is a Deuteronomic term, but used here without any Deuteronomic resonance. Conrad Schmidt writes of biblical motifs being Torah conscious when they seem to take up the network of specific details found in passages of Deuteronomy or Genesis. These motifs are thus connected not simply with Torah, but with the formation of the Torah. As such, they have a highly Deuteronomic resonance. Yet in Malachi, neither fear nor commandment are leveraged in this way. One is never given the impression that there is an emerging legal code, the Pentateuch as we know it, in any proximity to Malachi, except obviously for Malachi 3:22 at the end of the book. This is the exception that proves the rule, and we'll deal with Malachi 3:22 later in my paper. In the pursuit of Malachi's leitmotif, the next verses to consider would be Malachi 2:4-9 on the covenant of Levi, and then in chapter 3, verses 5, 16, and 20. Taken all together, these verses from chapter 1 and 2 and 3 indicate that those who fear God's name are at the center of the book of Malachi. The name of God they fear and glorify so as to occasion blessing and deflect curse. This constellation of ideas forms the text's leitmotif, which at times is referred to as a commandment in 2:1 and then in 2:4. We may in fact speak of a distinct discourse arising in Malachi inasmuch as it contrasts with Deuteronomic parlance. Words commonly associated with Deuteronomy, such as fear and commandment, are attested in Malachi's leitmotif, but they are not Torah conscious, to use Schmidt's term. The tension between Malachi's discourse and that of Deuteronomy comes into greater relief when we study the covenant of Levi. First, however, let's consider the role of reversals and puns in the language of Malachi. Of Malachi's reversals and puns, Michael Fishbane notes, and I quote, "The prophet's speech is replete with interlocking puns that condemn the priests measure for measure. Note, for example, the initial ironic appeal to beseech God, which is countered by the reference to the priest's desecrations. The ironic reversal of the priest's language, actions, and hopes is thus textured through a series of reworkings and plays on the liturgical language." End of quote. Fishbane's analysis has stood the test of time. The passage I read is from Biblical Interpretation in Ancient Israel, 1988. Although scholars since then have sought, through their interpretations, to soften Malachi's condemnation of the temple priests in Jerusalem, Fishbane captured well the vitriol of this prophet for particular priests. In Malachi, The most sustained and systemic instance of punning reversals occurs in reference not to the temple, but to another text, number 6, 24 through 27, commonly known as the Aaronite blessing. This is one of Fishbane's main foci, the interplay between Malachi and number 6, 24 through 27. The Pentateuchal text reads, "The Lord bless and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his face upon you and give you peace. So shall they put my name on the Israelites, and I will bless them." The Aaronite blessing speaks of face, panah, multiple times. So does Malachi. Malachi 1:8 reads, "Bring it your offering to your governor. Will he be pleased or lift your face?" This may be Malachi's first allusion to the Aaronite blessing. The next verse, Malachi 1:9 reads, "And now entreat the face of God, so that he might show you favor. Haluna Panael." This somewhat odd reference to God's face makes sense if the writer has in view number 625. The Lord make his face shine upon you. Ya'er Adonai panav elecha. When Malachi uses the Hebrew word face a third time in the final phrase of Malachi 1:9, Hayisa mekem panim, here the expression has become conspicuous. The prophet's phrasing with the verb hayisa from the root nasa, to lift up, matches very closely that of the Aaronite blessing, which reads, "The Lord lift up his face upon you," although number 626a is commonly translated less literally. The NABRE reads, "The Lord look upon you kindly." The JPS has, "The Lord bestow his favor upon you," although there is a note suggesting an alternative, "lift up his countenance." The next verse, Malachi 1:10 reads, "Who among you will shut the temple doors to keep from lighting altar fire in vain? Velo ta'ibu." In 1:10, the verb ta'ibu from or aleph vav resh does double duty. On the one hand, it sets up a pun whereby or light aleph vav resh becomes arur, curse, from aleph resh resh in Malachi 1:14. On the other hand, there is an allusion to number 625, which begins, "The Lord make his face, Ya'er, shine upon you." Then Malachi in Malachi 1:11 through 12 makes multiple references to God's name, which is one of the high notes that is struck in the Aaronite blessing. "So they shall put my name on the Israelites, and I will bless them." To summarize, Malachi 1:8 through 2:3 is a tour de force. Here, the author of Malachi radically reverses the Aaronite blessing in number 6 by working with keywords and phrases in piecemeal fashion. When in 2:2 the prophet announces, "I will send a curse among you, and I will curse your blessing, just as I have already cursed it," is this not a reference to the Aaronite blessing? To the rivals of this prophetic group is sent nothing shy of a curse that reverses their previous blessing. The coup de grace comes in 2:3. "Look, I will rebuke your offspring," literally your seed, Zerah, Zion Resh Ayin, "and I will scatter excrement upon your face." Scatter, Zeriti, from Zion Resh He. The text ends, "It is this, the excrement of your solemn feasts, and one will lift you and carry you away." So instead of "the Lord lift his face upon you," the people's faces are smeared with feces, and they are lifted away, banished. Allusions and puns abound, such as the scatological scattering, Zeriti, from Zion Resh He, forming a sharp contrast with the seed, Zion Resh Ayin, of a people with a great legacy. As the critique of the Aaronite blessing concludes, the covenant of Levi begins. While the latter does not replace the former, there is a void within which the covenant of Levi arises. A discussion ensues over 6 verses Malachi 2:4 through 2:9. The oracle on the covenant of Levi, like the previous oracles, alludes to the Aaronite blessing several times and always derisively. But there is a more primary and decidedly more positive literary relationship to be observed. The covenant of Levi exists to reinforce Malachi's leitmotif of fearing and glorifying God's name in a way that imparts identity to the priestly group, here associating itself with Levi. Through their associations with Levi, they gain the role of God's messengers. So in our outline, we're into section 3. This is 3:1, reinforcing both the leitmotif and the critique. In Malachi 2:4, the Lord Sabaoth says, "He has sent to you this commandment, to be my covenant with Levi." Now that phrase, "to you this commandment," is identical to Malachi 2:1, where earlier the commandment is to fear and glorify God's name. In that first context, God sends a curse upon the noncompliant priests, whereas here in 2:4, God sends the commandment that is synonymous with the covenant of Levi. The following verse, 2:5, describes Levi as fearing God and standing awestruck in the presence of God's name. The leitmotif of Malachi recurs. Levi is the exemplar. He reverses the curse. It is no coincidence that presence is denoted with the plural form of face, umifnei shemi. The face of God meets Levi as he reverences and glorifies the divine name. Umifnei shemi may or may not be in reference to the face of God in the Aaronite blessing, but the evidence for this begins to mount when elsewhere in the verse, God gives Levi life and peace. Peace, hashalom, is an echo of Numbers 6:26, whether intentional or not. Later in Malachi 2:6, Levi walks in peace, which is another echo of the Aaronite blessing. The covenant of Levi both extends the critique of the Aaronite blessing and it reinforces the leitmotif of Malachi. And just a footnote on peace. It is stated that Levi walks in peace. I think this also relates to Numbers 25. If you remember, Numbers 25 is where Phinehas, the Aaronite priest and zealot, is awarded a covenant of peace because he has killed a fellow Israelite and a man's Midianite wife, whose name is Cosby. So in Numbers 25, the covenant of peace becomes symbolic of the Aaronite cohort. Here, peace is associated with Levi in the book of Malachi. Now, the second of the two references to the covenant of Levi comes in 2:8. Here, it follows an accusation that the priests have deviated from the way and have caused many to stumble in Torah. The priests' misdeeds have corrupted the covenant of Levi, with the verb shikatem reflective of Malachi's leitmotif. We saw words from this root in Malachi 1:14, and we'll see them again in Malachi 3:11. It is significant that the writer here did not choose a more common term for undoing a covenant, such as breaking the pact, parar, or transgressing the covenant relationship, abar. Although these terms are well attested in Second Temple Discourse, here the priests corrupt the covenant of Levi, exactly as they sacrifice corrupt or blemished sheep to God. Another motif in Malachi, the verb despise, nibzim, punctuates the next verse, Malachi 2:9. Although here, it is God who despises the miscreant priests. Why are they despised? They do not keep my way, God states, and they raise faces in Torah. The phrase in question, they raise faces in Torah, is enigmatic. Some commentators interpret the nosim panim b'Torah as a charge of partiality. Peter Vohoff writes, the expression is taken in malum partem to show partiality. Their instruction of the law was instigated by material gain, and it was based on bribery and corruption, end of quote. Verhoff's analysis here founders on its subjective elements, bribery and corruption by the priests, which are simply not evidenced in the text of Malachi. Others explain partiality by way of linguistics, with the citation of lexica such as BDB. To lift up the face was to grant a request or show favor. The problem is that the source, BDB, does not apply this specific meaning to Malachi 2:9, nor do any other lexica. Rainer Kessler interprets face, panim, differently, but no less speculatively. Quote, "It could be thought that the priests are accused of not putting their faces on the line, and so ignoring Torah," end of quote. There's no consensus among modern interpreters. Ancient readers of Malachi, however, may well have interpreted panim in light of the prophetic critique of the Aaronite blessing. Recall how when the blessing was turned into a curse in Malachi 2:2, the priests' faces were smeared with feces. To lift so soiled a face to Torah would be an utter insult to God and God's ways. So this section on the covenant of Levi concludes with this condemnation of not only the corrupt priests, but as well of a priestly text, the Aaronite blessing in number 6. In his reading of Malachi, Rainer Kessler disassociates the Torah mentioned in Malachi 2:8 from the whole Torah of Moses, die ganze Torah des Moses. He holds that the Torah in Malachi 2:8 is not to be conflated with Malachi 3:22, which speaks explicitly about the Torah of Moses. Kessler associates such a conflated reading with the work of Andrew Hill, whom he rebuts, just like me. Rather, Kessler suggests the reference to Torah in Malachi 2:8 is a reference to direct speech from the mouth of a priest, as in the previous verse, Malachi 2:7. In 2:7, a priest's lips keep law, and the people seek Torah from the priest's mouth. The parallelism between the priest's lips and mouth mirror that established between Torah, and law, da'at. Significantly, the pairing of Torah and law is somewhat unique to this author and not found elsewhere, especially not Deuteronomy. The word law, da'at, appears only twice in Deuteronomy, and in both instances, it refers to a criminal's mental state, not to the codified teachings of Moses. The word Torah in the context of Malachi 2:7 is neither resonant with Deuteronomic thought, nor is it Torah conscious, to use the term of Conrad Schmid. In fact, those responsible for Malachi's oracle on the covenant of Levi appear averse to even indirect references to the Torah of Moses. For example, the previous verse, Malachi 2:6, says of Levi, "A Torah of truth was in his mouth. Injustice was not found on his lips. In peace and in uprightness he walked with me, and he turned many away from iniquity." A parallel expression occurs in Nehemiah, chapter 9, verse 13, which reads, "God descended upon Mount Sinai, and he spoke with them from the heavens. He gave them upright laws and a Torah of truth, good statutes and commandments." Note the recurrence of truth and uprightness as concepts applied to Torah. Nehemiah 9:13 sheds some light on Malachi 2:6. Mark Boda's linguistic analysis of the expression Torahs, the Hebrew form is plural, in Nehemiah 9:13, leads Boda to conclude that the text represents, quote, "a movement away from the Deuteronomic conception of law as a unity to a priestly conception of the law as a body of individual requirements," end of quote. That is to say, Nehemiah 9:13 contains only faint traces of the Deuteronomic perspective, such as its reference to Sinai. Nehemiah 9:13 and Malachi 2:6 were written in proximity to one another, and it is significant that neither construes Torah as a monolith along Deuteronomic lines. Rather, Malachi associates the Torah of truth and uprightness with a priestly figure, Levi, and lexically, it pairs Torah with da'at. Malachi is focused on a different literary tradition that is keyed to the fearing and glorifying of God's name. The next section on the outline 3.3, the covenant of Levi through the lens of Jeremiah, I will pass over today in the interests of time. Let me say simply this. There is a connection. Here I focus on Jeremiah 33, and specifically the reference in Jeremiah 33:21 to my covenant with my ministers, the Levites. My analysis shows that even though Malachi and Jeremiah 33:23 may not enjoy a literary relationship, there is a shared context, a shared covenantal context. And this gives us the opportunity to begin thinking about Jeremiah and Malachi as part of an axis about not only covenant, but also Pentateuchal issues. And I'll say more about Jeremiah later in the paper. On our outline then 4.0, the Pentateuchal redaction. The argument thus far is that there are two polarities: a certain form of Deuteronomism expressed through the Pentateuchal redaction on the one hand, and Malachi with its covenant of Levi on the other hand. Now, this can be the case only if there is a connective line between these two poles, between the book of Malachi and the Pentateuchal redaction. This line comes to light in the form of the Aaronite blessing in Numbers 6. We have observed in Malachi an antipathy to this blessing as an Aaronite text, and that is only the tip of the iceberg. Now we shall observe how the blessing of Aaron forms an integral part of the Pentateuchal redaction, and how together the Aaronite blessing and the Pentateuchal redaction elicit a strong reaction expressed in terms of the covenant of Levi in the book of Malachi. Recent studies on Numbers 6, 24 through 27 have changed how we think about the Aaronite blessing. Jeremy Smoke, in his 2016 monograph, refers to the shorter and likely earlier form of the blessing found on amulets at Ketef Hinnom. Smoke contrasts the amulets with the later literary articulation of the blessing. The writing of the blessing, found in the book of Numbers, quote, gave the book its ritual, power, and authority, end of quote. It did this in a manner much like the conferring of authority in other ancient Near Eastern contexts, when a blessing would be enshrined in writing at a cult site. By including the instructions for the priestly blessing within this unit of material, Smoke continues, the authors of Numbers, quote, created a tangible link between the blessing, the tabernacle, and the sons of Aaron. Put differently, the blessing's textual authority served a certain social group that identified with the sons of Aaron, end of quote. Textual authority is the focus of Ray Heckel in his 2019 article on the Aaronite blessing. The incorporation of the written blessing into the Pentateuchal materials, according to Heckel, reflects a stage in the literary process of Torah authorization, aka the Pentateuchal redaction. The process began with the figure of Moses, understood as the prophet whose unique relationship to God equips him with the authority to promulgate laws and statutes orally. As the process unfolded, priestly authors used said Mosaic authority to confirm changes they made to the narrative of Moses through a redaction of Deuteronomy and the books that preceded it. The process, which we have been referring to as the Pentateuchal redaction, further involved the incorporation of explicitly priestly texts, such as Numbers 6, 24 through 27, in order to claim that Aaron and his sons received from God an authority commensurate with that conferred upon Moses. In the words of Heckel, quote, Numbers 6:27 emphasizes the exclusiveness of the blessing given by the Aaronite priests at the temple of the Lord. It intends to canonize, that's Heckel's term, canonize the Aaronic blessing through the authority of Moses against different interbiblical and extra-biblical possibilities and versions, end of quote. What lies behind the blessing historically then are priestly polemics enmeshed in the Pentateuchal process. Heckel concludes that the strategic positioning of the Aaronite blessing in Numbers 6 is decisive for that process. The Aaronite blessing comes to support a view of successive composition of the priestly books of the Pentateuch in their finished form. That is, the Pentateuchal redaction is inextricably linked to the Aaronite blessing, and vice versa. Haeckel concludes, quote, "Number 6 is a step on the way to the canonization of Torah. The authority of Moses as the mediator of the will of God is used to privilege one text in its usage, and together with it the entire complement of older passages and their priestly interpretations. The Israelites are said to receive the blessing in number 6 as an expression of their acceptance of and identification with the form of relationship to God proclaimed at the Second Temple according to the priestly composed Torah," end of quote. My conclusion, 4.2. In Judean history, one group who identified with the sons of Aaron had an association with those responsible for the Pentateuchal redaction. It is plausible that this group maintained a covenant of some sorts to express and articulate their understanding of Israel's relationship to God. Such a covenant would have 2 dimensions. In Yehud at this time, covenant indicated bonds between persons and the deity that are expressed theologically, as well as specific alliances that are formed among human parties. The prevailing model of covenant in the Persian period integrated the theological and the sociological functions. Covenant as a concept reflected the dynamics of a group's identity within Judean society. And in this case, the alliance between the sons of Aaron and the priestly redactors is reflected in this covenant. Now, it's beyond the scope of my paper today to identify an Aaronite covenant that incorporated those responsible for the Pentateuchal redaction, but possible evidence in this regard would be, as I've already noted, Numbers 25, the covenant of peace with Phinehas. Also, a very good candidate, Numbers 18:19, the covenant of salt that is concluded directly with Aaron himself. While this alliance of Aaronites identified with one covenant, the writers of Malachi resisted them and in reaction articulated a different covenant. The covenant of Malachi, in Malachi 2:4-9, employs allusions, puns, and wicked reversals to critique the Aaronite blessing and eschew Torah-conscious language. The covenant of Levi champions the leitmotif of Malachi as focused on the blessing that comes to those who fear and glorify the name of God. The covenant of Levi is the manifesto of a Levitical group seeking separation from one of the more dominant priestly cohorts in Yehud at this time. The Levites' efforts were successful, but only to a degree. The last word went to their rivals, the Aaronite, using the figure of Moses to frame the Pentateuch and authorize their Torah teaching traditions. This other group shaped and gave definitive form not only to the Pentateuch, but as well to the book of the 12 prophets. Using an overarching redactional design, they brought the book of the 12, and Malachi in particular, into alignment with the Pentateuch. An example is the strategic insertion of Malachi 3:22. "Remember the Torah of Moses, my servant, which I commanded to him at Horeb for all Israel, statutes and judgments." This codicil to Malachi is extremely Torah conscious, and the phrase statutes and judgments is replicated across Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomistic history. Furthermore, Malachi 3:23b, which follows, contains the phrase, "Before the great and fearful day of the Lord, Yom Adonai Hagadol v'Hanorah," which is undoubtedly one of the last redactional touches added to the Book of the 12, and indeed to the operative collection of scripture at this time. In one stroke, those responsible for the Pentateuchal redaction undercut Malachi's leitmotif to fear and glorify God's name by importing an alternative expression, the great and fearful day, that would prove to be commonplace in the Hebrew Bible. The program to homogenize diverse approaches to Torah interpretation and neutralize opposition to the Pentateuchal redaction carried the day. Although textual traditions associated with the figure of Levi would perdure and find expression in Aramaic Levi, Jubilees, and the Temple Scroll. Postscript, implications. What are the implications of the Covenant of Levi, understood as a defining element in the opposition to the Pentateuchal redaction that took place during the Second Temple period? While our models of textual politics at this time should be recalibrated in several respects, two in particular require immediate attention. The notion that the Pentateuchal redaction provoked significant challenges has been appearing in scholarship over the past 10 years. Books and articles reconstruct the post-exilic debate about the modalities of divine revelation. One of the first studies in this vein is Eckhart Otto's Jeremia und die Torah, ein nach-exilischer Diskurs. Otto, for example, juxtaposes the commissioning of Aaron, who is an eloquent speaker because Moses puts words in his mouth, Exodus 4, with Jeremiah 1:7-9, where God puts words in the mouth of Jeremiah as part of the prophet's call and commissioning. The book of Jeremiah, as a locus of opposition to the Pentateuchal redaction, has been explored as well by Benedetto Rossi, who argues that Jeremiah 31:31-34, the New Covenant initiative, challenges the pattern of revelation established in Deuteronomy 34 through the figure of Moses, whose status as archprophet is said to preclude any other program of Torah interpretation and teaching. There are other scholars who are less explicit than Otto and Rossi in their analysis, but still focused on fissures and even dissent in the scribal culture at the time of the Pentateuchal formation. Specializing in Jeremiah, this group includes Mark Lüchter and Nathan Naschak, among others. While scholars are finding in Jeremiah increasing evidence of an opposition to the Pentateuchal redaction, as do I, the case now extends to Malachi. In Malachi, the covenant of Levi is closely linked to the rejection of the Aaronite blessing, a bulwark of the Pentateuchal redaction. We therefore should integrate Malachi's covenant of Levi into our understanding of how Jeremiah and Deuteronomy relate to the entire Torah during its final stages of composition. It will be important to understand how established data, such as Otto linking Exodus 4 with Jeremiah 1:7-9, how this data come into new light provided by the covenant of Levi. A second implication pertains to the Levites in history. To what degree can we correlate the moves reflected in the covenant of Levi with an elevated status for actual Levites in the Second Temple period? Such analysis is extremely challenging as Judean society was pluralistic and groups therein defined themselves through a range of issues. While we rightly assume that tension between groups often proved formative and fostered group identity formation, history itself is opaque, and we work in the realm of plausibility. Arguably, the books of Chronicles promote the elevated status of Levites as much or more than any other source in the Second Temple period. In Chronicles, the Levites are first-rate cultic functionaries. They are legitimate and vital. Moreover, Chronicles significantly expands the ranks of the Levites to include them in the ranks of ministers at the temple, lay ministers, but ministers nonetheless at the temple. Prominent are the non-priestly cultic personnel, such as the gatekeepers, who are listed in Chronicles 23-27, First Chronicles. In the world of Chronicles, did such favorable treatment of the Levites cause friction with other priestly groups identifying with the legacy of Zadok, or perhaps the legacy of Aaron? Both are mentioned in Chronicles favorably. The biblical text in its final form gives the impression of complementarity and harmony between Levites and priests, and Chronicles is rightly read along these lines by most commentators. There are, however, occasional signs to the contrary, as in Chronicles 1:23-27, which is that lengthy description of temple personnel. Here, Chronicles expresses special interest in the Korahites, a significant branch of the Levites. Chronicles designates the Korahites to be the temple gatekeepers. The chief gatekeeper is Shallum, said to be a descendant of Korah and the Korahites. And they had, in the days of yore, their special task of guarding the threshold of the tent of meeting. But there is more to the historiography that the chronicler is unfolding here. We remember in Numbers chapter 16 that Korah and his followers stage a rebellion against Moses and Aaron. The Korahites demand a more democratic form of leadership, but are punished for this action when the ground under their tents opens and swallows them alive down to Sheol. In the discourse of the Pentateuchal redaction, number 16 is a cautionary tale that reinforces the authority of Moses and Aaron. Korah's role is that of a Levitical foil, but not in Chronicles, where Korah is honored as gatekeeper. It is dry irony that the temple gatekeepers in Chronicles are put forward with a dual purpose. They are gatekeepers at the temple. They are also gatekeepers of Torah, the Levites, who resist the Pentateuchal redaction and band together as a cohort, not unlike the members of the covenant of Levi. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rich, for a rich and stimulating paper. And those of you who are in attendance, I'll remind you that we're going to field questions via the chat. So if you've got questions for Rich, let me encourage you to begin posting those in the chat, and we'll take those as they come in. Let's begin with a question here, Rich. We do have a few minutes for questions. Let's begin with a question here from Todd Hannikin. He asks, can you elaborate on the role of Exodus 32 in your understanding of Malachi's concept of the covenant of Levi on the one hand, and the Pentateuchal redaction on the other hand? How do you think a chapter so pro-Levi and anti-Aaron in its final form survived redaction?
Great question. My gut reaction is it survived redaction because there were a number of texts which those responsible for the Pentateuchal redaction simply left in place. In Deuteronomy itself, there are some very positive things said about the Levites in 18 and 31:9 and following. And rather than go through and strip those out, I think that they simply left them in place. Now, to Todd's question, Exodus 32, it's interesting because it's very pro-Levite, and it's also devastatingly anti-Aaron, in as much as in this particular account of the golden calf, we get details like this. Moses sees Aaron, and he says, it's Aaron who has let the people run wild. So yeah, this is damning of Aaron. But what I think is most significant is that when we find this account reiterated in Deuteronomy, it's in Deuteronomy 9:20, it's much more muted. Deuteronomy 9:20, it simply says that the Lord was upset with Aaron, but I, Moses, interceded, and it was okay. It was kind of this rehabilitation of Aaron that simply hinted at a total papering over of the misdeeds of Aaron. So what I would say is that Deuteronomy 9:20 is very reflective of the Pentateuchal redaction. What they did in terms of working with the entirety of the 5 books was that in Exodus 32 and elsewhere as well, they would simply leave certain texts, even though they were rather unflattering of the interests that these particular Aaronites were promoting.
Rich, we have a question here from Mark Smith. Is Elijah in Malachi the counter figure for Moses/Aaron to Pentateuchal priestly material? That is Elijah the heavenly proto-Levite?
That is a great question. Is Elijah the proto-Levite? I think he is sort of understood as sort of prophet par excellence. And he's understood as, certainly as sort of associated and in the line with these Levitical figures, although we don't have anything, specific, any textual information that would allow us to kind of make that connection there, unless you're seeing something, Mark, that I'm not seeing. And I would love to hear that if that's the case.
Other questions? We've got just a few minutes for a few more other questions. While we're waiting on other questions, Rich, let me ask you, you were talking about the leitmotif of fearing God's name in Malachi. Do you think this text in Malachi 2 changes the way that phrase is understood, or what that means, or is it just simply reusing that phrase in the way that it has always been meant?
I do think it issues it anew, in as much as it's not simply fearing God's name, but it's also giving glory to the name of God, which is a very, kavod is a very, has a lot of priestly resonance. Let's just leave it at that. So I think in a way it's kind of reissuing this core concept in the Hebrew Bible. Like I said, we find it in Proverbs and Deuteronomy, but it's kind of reissuing it with a particular spin, which is priestly, this idea of, kavod, the glory that is due to God's name, as well as the reverence or the fear that persons like Levi and the others in his train are to give to God.
Okay, good. We've got a question here from Cospater Adam. Let me kind of jump down here. He says, the question I have is more of a conceptual nature when looking at the themes of Malachi, namely about the fact that the priests are accused of falling short of the fear of Yahweh. Would you see any relation to the concept of the narrative traditions that are classically associated with the Elohist, i.e. fragments of Genesis 20, 21, 22, in which the fear of God plays such an important role and extends to non-Jews? He goes on to write, while Jonah also operates with it, like E, as a form of general knowledge of God, for instance, of Ahimelech in Genesis 20. On the contrary, the prophetic vision of the fear of the name of Yahweh in Malachi specifically refers to a specific privilege of the priests as they fall completely short of. So the discourse in Malachi, he writes, is indeed inner. I think it sort of cuts off at that point. So anyway, I will let you do with that. Take that as you deal with that as you wish.
Thank you for that question. I appreciate it very much. And I think there is work to be done in this regard. In chapter 1 of Malachi, around verse 10 and 11, we have the further excoriation of the priests. And then verse 11 has, for from the rising of the sun to its setting, my name is great among the nations. And in every place incense is offered to my name in a pure offering, for my name is great among the nations. So there is in Malachi, and John Collins has observed this, this kind of burgeoning universalism, which really contrasts with that, if we can say, more narrow and focused approach that those responsible for the Pentateuchal redaction are taking, not simply in that endeavor, but in general in their approach to texts and religion. So there is this greater sense of universalism. And I think that there is, I'm not sure if it's a springboard, and I'd have to think more about the relationship, but yeah, there is something right there, how we go directly from the condemnation of the priests to this language, and it's elsewhere in Malachi 2, of universalism. Across the world, among all nations, I am to be feared, and glory is to be given to my name. So great question, thank you.
Yeah, good. And I think we're going to let Todd Hannikin's question conclude our Q&A time here. He says, I know what the author of Jubilees would say, but what would Malachi say if asked? When was the covenant with Levi made?
When was the covenant of Levi made? If he were, if he had a hot mic, if he was, on Zoom to all these people, he would probably say, in antiquity, antiquity for him. But indeed, really, we're likely talking about 4th century or the 3rd century BCE. That is sort of my response in terms of the historical perspective. But yeah, I think I hear what Todd is saying. I mean, it probably would have been in Jubilee's estimation, even back before creation. So yeah, the party line would be that this is very ancient. Yeah, very ancient indeed.
Yeah, good. Well, I think we'll have to let that be the final word. Thank you again, Rich, for a very rich and stimulating paper. And thank you to all of our attendees for your attention and for your engagement in this. And thanks very much, all. Have a great conference.
Thank you so much.